So, welcome back to the Defiant Spirit podcast. I am Baruch Levy, also known as B, and I am delighted you have once again tuned in to this podcast where today we're going to be exploring the Enneagram of not just any person. We're going to be exploring today, as I'm recording this on MLK Day, Martin Luther King Day, Enneagram 8, because although I don't think he took a test, I think it's pretty much agreed. I certainly believe that Martin Luther King reacted and responded like an Enneagram 8. Now, this is a last minute podcast. I didn't have it as part of my regular scheduled programming, so might get to you a little bit late, but it'll still be timely going forward. And I just wanted to pay tribute to a great man and a great 8 who really defied his number and lived his spirit. So, what do we do with this idea that Martin Luther King reacted and responded as an Enneagram 8? For anybody who's just joining us, I say reacted and responded as much as I can. I mean, I will shorthand it sometimes that, I happen to react and respond like an 8. I sometimes will say I am an 8. You know how it goes. But it's not who I am. I mean, I'm an 8. But I also have a lot of 4 in me. Enneagram 4, the individualist. The Enneagram 8, the challenger. A lot of 7, the enthusiast. And then beyond the Enneagram, those are just pieces of my personality, of the energy that makes me up and you up. Have all kinds of different factors of who we are. So when we say I am, fill in the blank, it's so reductionistic. It reduces us. And I don't want anybody ever to feel reduced by these concepts, this system, certainly my defy your number take on it. On the opposite, I believe this can be about liberation of realizing this isn't who we are, it's where we react and where we respond. And this is the Viktor Frankl, my teacher mentor piece of between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space lies your power to choose your response. So just because things happen to us doesn't mean we have to react, doesn't mean we have to be unconscious, doesn't mean we have to be our personality and survive like we have. We can defy that. We can defy our number. We can choose our response. And that's why I think Martin Luther King is such a great example of an Enneagram, defy your number kind of approach, because most people seem somewhat surprised by Martin Luther King when I say he was probably an Enneagram 8. Why are people surprised? Well, I think there's multiple reasons. One of them is because I think we have deified a man. And I have challenges theologically with deifying a man. Nothing against other systems that go in a different direction, but I don't believe a man or a woman, a human being, can be God. That's just my theological worldview. I believe that human beings are mortal, and as being mortal, we can never be immortal. We can never be infinite if we're finite. And so Martin Luther King was a man. I see this. I've shared with you many times. I've officiated at well over 500 funerals as a rabbi, and sometimes people get vilified in death, and sometimes people get deified in death. So I've seen, people like turn their parents into one or the other, a saint or a sinner. And life is complicated. People are complicated. I don't think we're ever really either. Maybe there are extremes. Maybe, Adolf Hitler was the incarnate of evil, and Mother Teresa, well, not even Mother Teresa. I don't know who the perfect saint was, the Buddha. I don't know. But and Martin Luther King was a man, and I just think it's important because men and women human beings make mistakes. We have flaws, we have shortcomings. I refuse to turn anybody into a saint because I don't think it does them justice. I don't want to be. I definitely won't be. Canonized as a saint, but I wouldn't want to be, even if I could be. I want to be remembered as a real person with real hopes and dreams and strengths and aspirations, and also real struggles and shadows and shortcomings and failings. That's just who we are. I think we do a great disservice to the people whom we love in our lives when we want to turn them into saints, when we don't want to talk about the shadows. I'm not here to talk about Martin Luther King's shadows, but he had shadows. All you have to do is Google Martin Luther King shadows. You're going to come up with quite a few. So it's important to not do that, because if we do that, if we turn him into, Saint Martin, then we can't understand how he was an 8, because 8s don't seem like saints. Of all the types, I would argue they're probably the least likely to be, what's the word? I can't remember when you make somebody into a saint. There's a word, you'll email me. It's not really done in my religion tradition of birth. So, but certainly we can do great harm by making us think that, well, he couldn't be an 8. Well, we're overlooking the ingredients of Martin Luther King's being, of his time here on earth, which was obviously far too short. So let's get into some of those ingredients, because they are the ingredients of an 8. One of the things when I was a rabbi and I would have to do bat mitzvahs was I did not like. I'm sorry if you're listening. I'm sorry if you're one of them. But it's not really, it doesn't really work in this day and age, because I think 1,000 years ago it made sense. But when we became 13, we were a man, we were a woman, we get married, we'd go off, we'd go to war, we'd whatever, 14, 15. But now you're basically a child till you're like 33 out of grad school or something. So there's just such a distance between that 13 and that manhood or womanhood that it just always felt disingenuous. So it wasn't my favorite thing. But one of the things I really didn't like was I would make the kids give a bat mitzvah talk, something of meaning, value that they learned. And I had to ban Martin Luther King. I had to ban a handful of things because they became such cliches. Like, is Martin Luther King the only good person to ever walk the earth that we have to quote him in every speech? I love the man. I'm doing a podcast on him. But, oh my God, there's like a whole list of great men and women throughout history we can draw upon. So, I had to say, if all things possible, choose somebody besides Mother Teresa and Martin Luther King and a handful of other saints. So, and I say that because, again, Martin Luther King was not an easy person. 8s are never easy. How can you be easy if you're going to transform systems, if you're going to, devote your life to justice in a world that's so filled with injustice? You can be many things, but easy and 8s do not go hand in hand. So if you want to know the fundamentals of an Enneagram 8, start looking. You can check out my program. I give you plenty of examples, pictures. You're not going to find any easy 8s. Enneagram 9, the peacemaker behind me, you're going to find tons of easygoing Enneagram 9 peacemakers. You're going to find lots of easygoing 2s. You're not going to find lots of easygoing 8s. Martin Luther King was not easygoing. Why? Because at the core of an 8 is anger. And if you don't think Martin Luther King was angry, then you haven't listened to his speeches. Listen to this man's fire and brimstone. You don't get there without anger. Now, here's the crux of the conversation today, and whenever we talk about 8s that succumb to the anger, that react and react upon the anger, they're not great, right? Nobody's great if we succumb to our nature. The whole work of our life and what defines great men and women are those who are, as I've mentioned many times, supernatural. Martin Luther King was supernatural. He could not fly. He did not have X-ray vision. What do I mean by supernatural? Just like so many others were supernatural. Super means beyond or transcend, and natural's nature. And so he transcended his nature. That's what makes men and women great. When they have the capability to do something destructive, negative, harmful, hurtful, and they choose not to. It's no big, great thing for somebody who isn't capable of being competitive not to be competitive. Somebody who's not capable of, pick your issue. Oh, for me, I'm not heroic for not drinking. not being an alcoholic. I have, it's not in me. I tried for 4 years in college. I tried to be an alcoholic. I drank a ton. I probably should have been an alcoholic by, what I did in college, just like so many others listening. It was never in doubt. I was never in fear because it's just not my issue. It's not my stuff. Now I have other stuff that I grapple with, I wrestle with. That's not one of them. So for me to be courageous and brave, I've got to be facing something that is detrimental, that is an obstacle, that is a shadow. And so for an Enneagram 8 to overcome your anger, that's heroic. For an Enneagram 9 to overcome your anger, or a 2, it might be a tall order, but it's not usually, in my experience, heroic because that's not their battle. But for an Enneagram 8, somebody once said, when is an Enneagram 8? What angry? What makes an 8 angry? Here's the answer. 8s are always angry. I'm always angry. Now, you may not know it when we're talking. I hope you don't know it. You probably won't know it because I've learned how to defy that anger. I've learned how to harness it into something powerful, intensity. I can turn it back into something creative and constructive. Don't worry, I won't, blow you out of the water with anger, because that's the fear of a reactive 8. Now, if you've been around a reactive 8, you can feel it. They're scary. Reactive 8s make us feel unsafe. That's why many, if not most of the world's tyrants through history, dictators and just evil men and women, disproportionately, I have to say, are probably fellow 8s. If you look at the list, Saddam Hussein and Fidel Castro and Milosevic and maybe Hitler, though I think he was probably a 6 or maybe a 4. But the list goes on. It's really not great marketing for 8s. However, we also have transformative men and women like Martin Luther King. Why? Because he took that anger and he defied it. That's partially why he's so great, is because he stood for nonviolence, but he was capable of violence. How do I know that? Because he's an 8. We burn hot. There is no way this man was not capable of violence, more so than an Enneagram 9, the peacemaker, more so than a 4, the individualist. 8s who overcome that sort of violent intensity and do what he did, which is to go the exact opposite extreme, to transform this country, this world probably, through non-violent protest. My God, what a hero. We could have used him. I wish we had him for the past few years in America, certainly, where we've had violent protests. King never would have participated, did not endorse this. It's part of his back and forth between other leaders of civil rights who, if either promoted violence or certainly passively endorsed it. Martin Luther King did not, which is, again, so unbelievably remarkable given his Enneagram type, given what we know about Enneagram 8s. So to turn him into a saint, I think does a disservice to how response-able this man was, able to choose his response and not be a slave to it. Another thing that I don't think we appreciate with Martin Luther King is the centrality of this anger. We're so uncomfortable with anger that when I share that I think Martin Luther King was an 8, I also think I've changed my mind. I think Mother Teresa was an 8. I usually, in my Defy Your Number program, she's a 2, and I'll probably keep her there because you don't know. It's not that big of a deal. She definitely has a lot of 2 qualities. But the more I've read about, I listened to a podcast about Mother Teresa, she strikes me as an 8. This was not an easy woman. But again, I think we like to deify these people and turn her into something that she wasn't. Mother Teresa, right? We make it sound like, oh, so easygoing. Listen to stories about Mother Teresa. She wasn't easygoing. She wasn't nice all the time. If what you mean by nice is easygoing, go along, get along kind of a thing. That wasn't Mother Teresa. She had opinions. She had her sense of right and wrong. She had her agenda. She'd push you down that agenda, whether you like it or not. But thank God for that. Transformed the world around her because of that intensity. If I call it intensity, somehow it's okay. But if I call it anger, it's not. But this is the juice for an 8. Call it anger. In Hebrew, we might call it nephesh, which is somewhere like a soul. It's like the soul, but it's life force. Maybe that's a good translation of it. So the nephesh, this life force, this intensity, burns hot in 8s for 1,000 different reasons. But for Martin Luther King, I think it's important to channel this man's anger, to channel this man's nephesh, whatever you want to say, this life force, because our society is very uncomfortable with anger, with intensity. You can never be too mellow, but you can certainly be too intense. And I see that with my kids. I'm even guilty of this. I got 4 kids, but I got a daughter who's an Enneagram 9, the peacemaker, and a daughter who's a pain in the 8 like me. She's an 8-hole, and she's intense. And usually I'll go after her for being too intense. Rarely do I go after her sister for being too passive. They're both problematic. They're both ways of forcing our way through the world or avoiding what needs to be dealt with. They're both reactive. So we have a harder time, I think, with the 8 intensity. And you can just see it all throughout our society, but we're very uncomfortable with 8. Now, I understand why, because being overly passive is a long-term destructive. Like if you're passive aggressive, like maybe a 9 or a 1, then or 2, you can do great damage to a relationship. But usually passive aggressive is a corrosive element over time, Saying yes, but meaning no, not doing something takes a long time to catch up the consequences usually. But in 8, I can do a lot of damage real quick, like within one conversation can destroy a relationship with hurtful things said. I mean, we all have examples of this. Maybe they weren't always 8, but very much an 8 vibe, and certainly disproportionately 8-ish. 8s can blow things up. Other types can too, and other subtypes in particular, but in general, 8s do a darn good job of blowing things up. So I understand why we are so scared of it, but the answer isn't to get rid of it. It's to harness it. It's to become response able to respond. I don't want us to get rid of anger. I don't want to live in a world that doesn't have anger, that is simply om. Why? Because pissed off people fix the world. I want you to be pissed off about cancer, about pick your poison that's ruining lives, that's destroying lives. Get mad, raise money, fund research, come up with solutions. 8s are disruptors. We want to disrupt the status quo. We want to disrupt injustice. So coming back to Martin Luther King, my God, thank God for this man and his angry 8 energy, and for not succumbing to it, not giving himself over to it. Again, was he perfect? Absolutely not. But we wouldn't have a day celebrating him if it weren't for the fact that he had his challenges and he harnessed, he used those challenging elements of his personality, of his makeup, and he did good with them. As an aside, this is why we must get rid of cancel culture. We must stop canceling people because people are complicated, and we'll have no days whatsoever if we start canceling everybody who was imperfect. If we start tearing down every statue that was representative of somebody who didn't live up to our standards of perfection. Martin Luther King shouldn't have a day, shouldn't have statues, shouldn't have his name perpetuated like we do if we're going to hold him accountable to every mistake he made. And we don't. We're very selective on this cancel culture thing. So let's cancel culture, and let's celebrate people for their successes, and let's forgive them for their mistakes. Let's contextualize things. Let's put them into the context of their time. Somebody sent me an email a while back that Viktor Frankl was misogynistic because it's called Man's Search for Meaning, and read through the book. It's men. It was his time. It was the language when he was writing in the 1940s and onwards. He came from a different world. Don't hold people to our standards. That's immoral. Hold them to the standards of their day, contextualize things, and also at the end of the day, let's be forgiving and see people as a whole and celebrate, again, their contributions. Certainly is the case with Martin Luther King. So he embodies what great mystic named the Koritzer Rebbe. I've shared this many times before. This is a driving quote for me in my life. We all have a handful of these, and this is one of mine. The Koritzer Rebbe said, "I conquered anger a long time ago, and now I keep it in my pocket. That way it's there close to my heart when I need it." This was a mystic, right, who understood that there are times when we need access to our anger. We should not live it. We should not allow it to drive the bus, but there are times when we need to stop the bus and take out the anger out of our pocket and use it. And I think that that's really one of Martin Luther King's greatest contributions, of carrying the anger in his pocket and using it, not being used by it. So really just an important aspect of Martin Luther King that I don't think anybody really is talking about, that does talk about on this day of, MLK Day, wonderful things being said about him. But I think this is one of his greatest contributions. Friedrich Nietzsche once said, remember this from memory, "I have verily laughed at men who thought themselves good because they had no claws." Right? What does that mean? It means that just because you remove somebody's claws doesn't make them good. It means they have no claws. Now you can fill in the blank with claws, whatever that is to you. I use the example sometimes. I work with a lot of recovering addicts. And ultimately, if you are on a desert island, as a recovering alcoholic as an example, and you have no access to a bar, are you really sober, right? Are you really recovering? If you have no access to the battle, to the evil, or have you ended up in a situation where you have no claws? I would say the same is true about anything we're facing. If it's not part of our makeup, of our struggle, am I heroic for not drinking? No, it doesn't. It's not my battle, but I am heroic for overcoming my claws. I resonate with Martin Luther King. I resonate with the anger thing. I must stand guard against it. I must use it and not be used by it. I must harness it and turn it into what another teacher of mine, Abraham Joshua Heschel, called righteous indignation. I want to be around people who are righteously indignant. I don't know if that's how you say it. I don't want to be around people who are angry. And you can be around, it's the same energy, but one is constructive and one is destructive. We all have our claws. We all have our battle. The Enneagram is really powerful and beautiful for helping me and others understand what those battles are and pathways to stop reacting and start responding and becoming responsible, able to respond. And that's my take on this MLK Day for you on the journey as you think about this great man and what he represented, because what he represented is much bigger than the man. And that is to not succumb to violence, even if we think it could be justified in the moment. I heard people doing this during the BLM riots, that it was justified. The means justifies the ends. Martin Luther King would have never signed off on that. We can never, should never succumb to the claws, succumb to our makeup, to our nature. It's not good enough. We are here, and we have plenty of examples like Martin Luther King to show us of a better path, a higher path. And that path is and should always be to become supernatural, to rise above our nature, to defy our nature, not to get rid of it, it doesn't go away, but to put it in our pocket for safekeeping, because whatever your particular claws are, your battle is, there's a time and a place for you to take it out and use it. There's nothing that's been given to us that doesn't have a blessing, a source of energy within it that is good. And our work, whether it's with the Enneagram or just in life in general, is to go into those shadows, to go into that arena and to master it, right? And not be mastered by it, and to harness it and to put it to work for the greater good. Thank you, Martin Luther King. That is one of the many examples that you have left. And certainly for me, on this MLK Day. I'm just honored and privileged to be able to share an Enneagram 8, a healthy, response-able Enneagram 8. I will try and do that going around the Enneagram. There are plenty of wonderful examples of each type. So if you have any ideas, shoot me an email. We'll maybe even tie them to particular days that we have off here in America or in the world where we celebrate. To me, this is a better way to celebrate than what my kids are doing on MLK Day, which is refraining from going to school and going to the mall. I'm not sure MLK would have signed off on that. I think we can do better. We should do better. So let's think about different ways we can honor great men and women throughout history. And one of the ways I can think of is the Enneagram. So thank you to a response-able 8. I will talk to you in the next podcast. Until then, defy your number and live your spirit.